Welcome to another video, guys. So this video is going to be a bit of a follow-up on the last video that I made, which was a defensive comparison of some of the more popular setups in the game right now. If you didn't see that video, you can check it out here. But essentially, this video was just comparing some really popular defensive setups in the game right now that are fairly similar. We were comparing a Transcendence setup with a Incandescent Heart plus new Mastery and Divine Flesh setup, and one with the new unique body armor, the 4th VOW. These are all pretty strong defensive setups and are actually quite comparable when you compare them across the board against different damage types and different abilities and things like that. But in this video, I basically just made some rough comparisons with some made-up damage numbers, and I've had a lot of people asking for real damage numbers pulled from the game. So in this video, we'll be doing that comparison with boss abilities, damage from boss abilities, so that we can actually get a real example of how these setups actually stack up against each other. And there was also quite a few people asking why I didn't include the Incandescent Heart plus Chaos Inoculation setup in the last video. Well, the reason why I didn't include that is because that setup is an entirely different build, a non-life based build, so it doesn't really compete with those other builds that I was talking about, but I will include it in this video here. Just so people can check that out and see exactly what sort of damage that build takes in comparison to the others as well. So let's get into it. I'll do a very brief overview once again for each defensive setup for the people who are wondering exactly what they are. So the first setup is using the new unique body armor. This is called the 4th VOW. It has a modifier on it that applies your full armor value to chaos damage taken from hits. And we're combining this body armor with Divine Flesh, which is a keystone that makes you take 50% of elemental damage as chaos damage. The second setup is using the Incandescent Heart body armor, which is another unique body armor. This one has a modifier that makes us take 25% of elemental damage from hits as chaos damage. We'll also be using Divine Flesh with this setup as well, and the new armor and energy shield mastery that applies 10% of armor to chaos damage taken from hits. The third setup is using the Transcendence keystone, which applies your full armor value to elemental damage taken from hits. This keystone also applies a hefty maximum resistance penalty, so we'll be using a max roll Lore Weave in this setup to counter that downside. And as I mentioned before, I'll also be including a fourth setup in this video. This one is using the Incandescent body armor with the Chaos Inoculation keystone, which brings our maximum life down to 1, but makes us fully immune to chaos damage. So essentially the modifier on the Incandescent Heart will just be removing 25% of elemental damage from hits. Okay, so the damage numbers that are going to be used in these examples are based on the numbers used in the presets in Path of Building. If you don't know what Path of Building is, it's a tool for basically checking and approximating different things within a build in Path of Exile. You can create builds, check what sort of damage it's going to deal, check what sort of damage it's going to take, and things like that. I'll leave the link to Path of Building down in the description. But these numbers are calculated using any monster modifiers that would apply to the boss by default, and any modifiers that would apply to the ability, such as any more multipliers and things like that. The Path of Building preset boss abilities assume a 70% roll on any damage number ranges. And once again, these examples will only be looking at elemental damage taken. This is because the Lore Weave setup needs to have other mechanics in place to deal with physical damage, such as damage taken as, and the other setups have plenty of room for other mechanics to be factored in too, so this is just a showcase for elemental damage. Once again, we are approximating that each build has 50,000 armor, and I've given each build maximum resistances based on how I would believe you'd allocate your resources. The 4th VOW and Divine Flesh setup has 78% maximum elemental resistances and 80% maximum chaos resistance. The Incandescent Heart with Divine Flesh and Mastery setup has 75% maximum elemental resistances and 86% maximum chaos resistance. The Transcendence and Lore Weave setup has 78% maximum resistances based on a max roll Lore Weave. And the Incandescent Heart and the Chaos Inoculation setup has 75% maximum elemental resistances and is immune to chaos damage. I should note here that the 50,000 armor in the Incandescent Heart and Chaos Inoculation setup is fairly irrelevant for these examples because we'll be looking at elemental damage and not physical damage, and this setup has no way to apply armor to those damage values. However, in-game, obviously the armor will not be useless because it will be useful against physical damage and for the use in things like Molten Shell and other stuff like that. So first of all, we'll look at a few standard Pinnacle boss abilities before moving on to some Uber Pinnacle boss abilities. Let's start off with a normal Shaper Ball. The preset for this ability is 12,944 cold damage with 25% cold penetration. The fourth VOW setup takes 3,087 cold damage and 157 chaos damage for a total of 3,245 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes 1,642 cold damage and 800 chaos damage for a total of 2,442 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes a total of 2,346 cold damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup takes 4,926 cold damage and 3,284 chaos damage reduced to 0 for a total of 4,926 damage after all mitigations. In this example, you can see how powerful the damage taken as mechanic is against a large amount of penetration. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup is able to avoid all of the penetration on 75% of the damage taken. Alright, let's look at the normal Searing Exarch Ball phase. The preset for this ability is 16,557 fire damage with no penetration. The fourth VOW setup takes 1,821 fire damage and 231 chaos damage for a total of 2,053 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes 1,034 fire damage and 1,095 chaos damage for a total of 2,130 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes a total of 983 fire damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup takes 3,104 fire damage and 4,139 chaos damage reduced to 0 for a total of 3,104 damage after all mitigations. Against a large hit with no penetration, you can see how much stronger the fourth VOW setup becomes. The Transcendence setup is the strongest by far in this example, as it's able to apply the full armor value to all of the damage. Okay, now let's check out some Uber Pinnacle boss abilities. Let's once again start with the Shaper Ball ability. This time it's the Uber variant, and the preset for this ability is 13,584 cold damage with 40% cold penetration. The fourth VOW setup takes 4,274 cold damage and 165 chaos damage for a total of 4,439 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes 2,240 cold damage and 854 chaos damage for a total of 3,094 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes a total of 3,932 cold damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup takes 6,721 cold damage and 3,446 chaos damage reduced to 0. For a total of 6,721 damage after all mitigations. You can see how much weaker the Transcendence armor mechanic is when a larger hit gets through due to a large amount of penetration. The fourth VOW is competitive with Transcendence in this example, and the Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes the least damage as it is able to avoid penetration on 75% of the damage. Now let's look at the Uber Maven memory game. The preset for this ability is 40,820 damage of each element, cold, lightning and fire with no penetration. The fourth VOW setup takes 4,557 damage of each element and 6,836 chaos damage for a total of 20,508 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes 2,589 damage of each element and 12,137 chaos damage for a total of 19,906 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes a total of 4,375 damage of each element for a total of 13,125 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup takes 7,768 damage of each element and 31,074 chaos damage reduced to 0 for a total of 23,305 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup is extremely powerful in this example as the full armor value is applied separately to each element, massively reducing the damage taken. Lastly, let's look at the Uber Azeri Flame Blast. This preset has 74,938 fire damage with 10% fire penetration. This damage is then adjusted for the map modifier 60% monster damage on the Alluring Abyss. The fourth VOW setup takes 19,184 fire damage and 6,594 chaos damage for a total of 25,778 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Divine Flesh setup takes 10,491 fire damage and 11,708 chaos damage for a total of 22,199 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes a total of 30,310 fire damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup takes 31,473 fire damage and 29,975 chaos damage reduced to 0 for a total of 31,473 damage after all mitigations. You can see how much weaker the armor mechanics become against a very large hit. The Incandescent Heart Chaos Inoculation setup is competitive with the Transcendence setup in this example as it's able to remove 25% of the damage. Hopefully this was useful to compare these setups for actual boss abilities. Obviously actual builds using these setups may have plenty of other ways to reduce damage taken, such as reduce damage taken modifiers on ascendancies, or less damage taken modifiers like spell suppression or fortify, or even the modifiers from flasks. I'll also briefly mention this shield, as some people were commenting that I should have included it in the previous video. So this is a unique shield, Mahuzotl's Machination. Grants a bunch of keystones that all interact with each other in different ways. I'm not going to go into exactly how it works in this video. That will be for another video, I suppose. But essentially, because this shield gives you Divine Flesh, it means that your Timeless Jewel slot is freed up to be able to use other Timeless Jewel keystones, such as Tempered by War. What Tempered by War does is it allows you to take 50% of lightning and cold damage as fire, and so with this combination you can take 50% of lightning and cold damage as chaos and then the other 50% as fire, and that means you can completely ignore those resistances and just focus on chaos and fire. This was strong before this patch, but now because of the introduction of the fourth VOW and the new mastery, you can use that with this setup, and that makes it really, really tanky. That's going to be an incredible defensive setup, but you do have to go through some hurdles to actually work out the kinks of the shield, because it provides a bunch of stuff, but it also cancels out some other things as well. Anyway, I thought I'd just mention it here. That's going to be a very strong setup. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please click the subscribe button and come back for more content like this in the future. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.